We are back. We're back. All right. Loot Studios are the enterprising people who provide you with a set of 3D printable miniatures each month as part of a subscription. They cover both fantasy and sci-fi, and their miniatures are pretty impressive. After I did my "There's more to gaming than just Warhammer" video, they hit me up and told me about a new game they're launching called Malediction. And honestly, this might be a system that changes tabletop miniature gaming as we know it. It also might not, but it might be. I printed and painted a couple of miniatures for the game, and I want to take you through the process of painting them, creating a small diorama, so that you can get an idea of what the miniatures are like and what Malediction has to offer. 2025, let's jump in. Malediction is primarily a card-based tabletop miniatures game. When you buy the game, you get the box with standees, rules, cards, and everything that you need to play. But instead of filling the box with stacks of plastic sprues and terrain, they provide you with the files to print your own. And as I understand it, they'll work with some providers to print for those who don't have a printer at home. Of course, you can play the game without the minis. In fact, right now you can go to the site, which is linked in the description, download a print and play version of the rules and get started. But for those of us that are more keen on the minis and painting them up than the gameplay, this is an interesting setup. In principle, I love the idea. It opens up to model improvements and easy iterations. It means if you only want one or two of the minis, you can just print one or two, or find someone who will print them for you. And as 3D printers become more common, I can see other games going this way too. I understand that for some creators and publishers, the lack of control over the final result is probably a concern, and so I think there will always be a market for pre-printed miniatures. But imagine instead of buying and waiting for your Space Marines to arrive, you could customise them on Warhammer.com, set up the insignias and weapon options you wanted, then print the STLs at home in whatever sub-assemblies you wanted for painting and playing. Sadly, I don't see Warhammer doing this, but I think it's going to become more and more of a viable option for games manufacturers going forward, and I think Loot Studios should be applauded for taking a big step down this route. I was fortunate enough to have Loot Studio send me some of the STL files for Malediction, and I was keen to print up a couple and paint them up. I do a bit of printing here and there, and although I don't want this to become a 3D printing channel, I do want it to continue to be a painting one. So I fired up the printer and I went to town so that you can see me paint these up. The minis are 42mm scale, so a touch bigger than the smaller Warhammer models, but not so big that they're a pain to paint. I ended up printing the poster boy for the game, Thundersteps, as well as one of these HUSK terrain pieces, because they look properly gruesome. They were thankfully pre-supported, so no headaches worrying about that, and they printed perfectly. I suspect my own printer settings could be tweaked, but I use my 3D printer like your auntie uses her iPhone, with a degree of caution and probably with half the settings wrong. But listen, it works for me. I'm going to go kind of grimdark with these since it fits the style of the game, so hopefully we can get dirty and grimy while doing something fun here. First step, as always, was a primer, so I went with Hyrax Brown from Colourforge. This is a dark brown and it gives us a nice, dark, grimy start. Plan is to give this a few layers of Drybrush first to build up some lighter tones, so Mud Brown was my first Drybrush layer. I did this all over and it took a wee while just with the size of the model, but already that had started to build some of the definition. I sized down a brush and then went with medium sand after that. I concentrated on the more upward facing areas as usual and still went pretty hard with this layer. And then lastly, I sized down a brush again and I used one of my favourite AK paints, Grimy Grey, to go over the upward facing areas more lightly. Ultimately, this gave me a really nice bit of definition on all the areas of detail with very little work. For all the Smurf perverts out there, I decided I'd go for blue skin here, so I cracked out Anthracite Grey, which isn't grey, is actually blue, and proceeded to paint the trouser leg. Yes, not the skin, total mistake. It took me a minute to realise what I'd done too, so I pretended like it had never happened and carried on painting. If you don't tell anybody, I won't either. I figured I'd pick leather brown for the trousers and do them next to hide the shame of painting things wrong. Not a major deal, I gave them a swift coat and everybody forgot about it. I'd sort of inadvertently got myself into painting just base coats here, so I figured grimy grey would work for all the bones. That meant tusks and a few skulls, plus some other random bones strung around the model. Next up was all the silver. Again, a simple base coat on all the metallic areas of Vallejo silver. I went lighter on these since the plan by this point was to wash everything back to darker tones. I did the same with copper on all the remaining areas of metal just to have some variation in metallic colours. I figured it would be worth going over the diamond eye he has in pure white, as well as catching the teeth at this point since I wanted them to be reasonably bright vibrancy wise. They serve as something of a focal point on the Mini. I then went back to the skin and I grabbed dark blue-grey to layer up on the anthracite colour just to get a bit more definition on those skin areas before I washed everything back. Then it was time for the actual washes. I figured contrast paints would work well here, so I started with Gore-Grunta fur. I also picked out parts in Fireslayer flesh, and then I used Skeleton Horde on the bone. The silver was covered in Black Templar, or if you're looking for a brighter or lighter approach, Basilicanum Grey. And then I figured Gryph-Charger Grey would be a good darker blue style grey wash for the skin. I then left it for a day. It was going to take a while for that to dry, and it felt like a good place to stop. So coming back a day later, it was time to bring some of the metal back up in colour, and I felt a dry brush of silver would do the trick. Even on gold, a nice silver dry brush or an edge highlight will make things look nice and tarnished. For the bone areas, I got the grimy grey back out again for a dry brush of those areas, since the contrast will have stained the upper areas on those parts and I wanted them brighter. Instead of a red, I went with Magmadroth Flame as a more orangey tone for the eye, and that went over nicely on the white, and it had enough pigment to be able to work as a very small OSL type effect around the eye, as if the gem was sort of producing or reflecting a lot of that light. To bring some more definition to the skin again, I went in with Spectrum Blue, which is a very pale pastel blue colour, and I picked out some of the highlights. I also got a little white to edge the gemstone eye while I was at it. With that done, I was more or less happy with the big fella, and I set him aside to wait while I painted up this gruesome husk. I took the same dry brush approach as before since it made sense to have it all start from the same point colour-wise. It did exist in the same universe after all. From there, I wanted all the bodies on this thing to look like real human flesh, which was sort of moulded and morphed in and around this thing. So the first step was part 1 of my basic flesh recipe, Citadel's Bugman's Glow. Next up was Cadian Flesh Tone, a mid-white skin colour which I used to build the volumes, and then after that I went over with Kislev Flesh to do the same but with just the highlighted areas. Normally I'd go lighter to an ivory type colour after this, but I figured I'd end up dry brushing lighter tones on, so good old grimy grey did the trick as a light dry brush over everything to tie it all together. Magmadroth Flame went into the sort of hole in this thing, and then I washed the rest with like a skin tone contrast paint. I can't quite see this pot, but I'm sure it was Guilliman Flesh or something like that. The point is, it's not super important what specific paints I'm using here, I guess. You can kind of approximate these with whatever you have to hand. The last part of this piece was Blood for the Blood God. This is a special effect or a technical paint from Citadel, which is quite a goopy, glossy red which simulates blood. I had a blast with this, diluting it a little bit with water and trying to get it to look like it was kind of pissing out of eyes and all the orifices, as well as just covering the thing generally with some carefully placed streaks. Then I had to figure out how to get all of this onto a base. I had opted to leave the base off the Thundersteps model, and although I'd added it to the husk to keep the husk from tipping over while I was painting it, I realised I'd end up putting them on the same diorama plinth type thing, so really I didn't need to bother with the base for the Thundersteps. That said, I'd work something out. I had a reasonably sized piece of foam, which I thought might work quite well for this. It wasn't as squishy as normal foam, it was a little bit more solid, and it wasn't exactly a display standard plinth, but it was soft enough to cut with a craft knife and hard enough to work as a reasonable kind of base. So I marked some rough areas on it for the model, and I cut out notches for the parts under the feet to slot into. I had a rough idea of where the husk would be, so with that in mind, I grabbed some rocks and I built around the back of the model to help frame things a little bit and to provide some visual interest. These were hastily superglued down before I popped the husk on, marked out where the base would sit on that, and then cut out that part of the foam with my craft knife. Now, I then decided I'd glue the husk in place and work my way around with some PVA glue, which I then kind of sprinkled some sand over to get a ground texture of sorts. And part of me was just winging it with this, and as I did this, I realised I'd made a bit of a mistake. I wanted basically to spray the base to prime the rocks and the sand texture, but because I'd glued the husk on now, I'd need to cover that up or mask it off to avoid basically resetting all the work that I'd done on that. So I decided a small plastic bag would suffice. We're being pretty rough here, and ultimately I managed to get the thing sprayed without ruining the husk's paint job. Obviously you can see gaps where the bag was as well as finger marks, but really that wouldn't be a massive issue since this was just the priming stage. I found a dark brown paint to paint round the remaining areas and fill the gaps, and it kind of went on okay without a primer. And then I decided to give some more texture paint a go. So the stuff I used was Terraform Beach Sand by Ammo, and through some act of idiocy I'd managed to miss recording this, but basically I just used a little oil paint spatula thing to whap it on around the areas where the model wasn't going to be standing. It was great, you'll have to take my word for it. After all that had dried, I gave everything a coat of burnt umber to bring it all into line, and then proceeded to bring the rocks up in colour with grey-brown. I did the same with reddish-grey after that, and then as that was drying, I mixed up some diluted PVA glue with water, and this time I used more water than I had done previously, and I slapped that on all over, except the upper areas of those rocks. Now the plan here was to use some new ground covering I'd discovered while out at Spiel in Essen this year. Last year, in fact. Krautcover Scenics make this delightfully grimy flock-style covering called A Tale of Grimdark. It's ground cover, but mixed in are little bones and skulls for extra grimness. So big shout out to Jeff from the Painting Phase for showing me this stuff at Spiel and prompting me to go and pick up a tub. Once that was all dry and all my sins were covered up, I managed to get the giant base rim painted in black, and when that was done I just had to tidy up the bottom of the husk with some extra blood for the blood god where I'd covered that with the paintwork. When that was done, we were all set, a small, grim diorama. I was really pleased with how this turned out and how quickly I was able to pull it all together, to be honest. The ground cover really brought it together, and the models themselves are super nice and dark. If you like the look of them and you fancy getting your hands on them too, you can find out more about Malediction the game and the minis, as well as the crowdfunding campaign over at malediction.gg, or check the description for all the relevant links. Thank you to Loot Studios for sending me these, and thanks again to you for watching. As ever, feel free to comment, like and subscribe to the channel. It's all free and it helps me immensely. Until next time, cheerio.